The Marino Show. Hello, everybody. I'm David Marino. Welcome to The Marino Show. Today, I'm talking to C. Thane Dixon. He's the host and producer of the What a Character podcast. It's a podcast dedicated to character actors, and it just launched in March. C. Thane Dixon, thank you for being with me today.
Oh, it's great to be here, David.
So I checked out, your podcast. Your first episode dropped with Daniel Roebuck. Mm-hmm. Tell me what the inspiration was behind starting this podcast and what it's actually about.
Well, I've been a cinephile for almost all of my life, and I've had always had an appreciation for all of the creative aspects of filmmaking, and one of the aspects I've had a major appreciation for is acting. But my favorite kind of actors have always been character actors. I think because character actors are always allowed more freedom when it comes to playing their characters, so they're allowed to do things that a lead actor cannot do, and that what makes those performances a lot more interesting. And also I feel that character actors aren't paid much attention to in media. I feel that a lot of them don't really get the respect they deserve. So I wanted to do a show, that gives them the attention and, talks about, really focuses on show business from their perspective.
Which is very unique because, like you said, a lot of times when you think of actors and people kind of focusing in on actors, it's always the lead actors in a film. But those character actors are so important in carrying the story along. And for you, as you said, you've always been more focused on the character actors. Is there a film that you can remember that just sort of stuck with you in terms of a character actor that you just thought, wow, that person really carried that film or should have gotten more attention?
Oh man, there's so many movies, but the most recent one I can think of is the film Starship Troopers. Jake Busey's performance in that film, I think, is the most interesting performance in it. I mean, you have Casper Van Dien, who's the lead, and he's great as the hero, but then you have Jake, who's sort of this, wild, gun-toting redneck character, and he steals every scene he's in. And that's an example of how character actors can steal a movie, because, character actors are allowed to play characters that are a little bit off the wall or different from the normal characters that the lead is supposed to play, and in that sense, it makes a film, and also it makes the film a lot more interesting.
In some of your conversations with the actors that you've interviewed so far, what are the main takeaways that you're getting from them? Did they aspire to be a character actor for some, or did that just happen?
I think a lot of them wanted to be big stars, but many of the actors I've interviewed have always wanted to be character actors. I think they always kind of knew that they didn't have what it took to be a leading man. Maybe they weren't the right physical shape, or maybe they weren't, they didn't have the qualities that a leading man or woman has. So, yeah.
Who are some of the actors that you are having on this season of the show? As I said, it's a new podcast. You just launched in March, and your first guest was Daniel Roebuck, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I don't know how these things happen. I mean, I just think I saw my future, and I lived toward my future. But as a child, I was performing a lot, Cullen. And I don't mean like, oh, I'm going to do jokes. I had a routine. I was hired to do. I did talent shows as an impressionist. And then somebody saw me and hired me to do my little impression show at some event. Like, they paid me $10. It was $1 a minute in in 1975, Colin. I was the richest man in Bethlehem. There was nobody made $1 a minute. I even remember saying to my father, I made $1 a minute. How much do you make? So I learned that lesson very quickly. And I knew not to discuss money anymore with my parents or anybody else. And I just was always performing, writing, directing. I started, there's kind of a story that's been going around that's completely true. I wrote a play when I was in first grade, but when you were in first grade, when I was a child, you didn't know how to write your name. So the temerity that I must have had when I walked into school one day and I said, I wrote a play. And Sister Kathleen, my first grade teacher, said, oh, well, let's perform your play.
What are some other guests that are going to be coming up throughout the season?
Coming up, we have Lance Henriksen, we have Jake Busey, who I mentioned earlier, Kathleen Wilhoit, Robert Davi, the late Philip Baker Hall, who I interviewed months before his passing. So
you said you've always been a cinephile. So as a kid, what types of films did you really grow up loving?
I loved 1940s comedies. I always loved films starring the Marx Brothers or Laurel and Hardy. I love Pixar movies, animated films, but growing up, I always eventually gained more appreciation for dramas, action films, crime thrillers, and that sort.
Is this your first podcast, or had you had others before this one?
No, this is my first podcast. For years and years, I've always considered doing a podcast. And then it was during COVID where I had a lot of time to myself. I wasn't really working that much. Wasn't really living much of a social life, and you can probably figure out why. So then I decided, hey, I'm alone, need something to do. I'll finally start that podcast I've been thinking about starting for years. And here we are.
It's awesome. When I started this show, it was sort of the same thing. I was co-hosting with someone, then I ended up taking it over. And my thing was, I love like horror movies. So you've seen some of probably my interviews have been with horror actors. And I just, in the beginning, wasn't really interviewing actors, but then I just started reaching out to them like on Instagram or on their various channels. But I was really nervous to do that before because I thought they're not going to say yes. For you, how did that process come about? Did you have any nerves reaching out to these different people that you probably admired, seeing in all these films? How did you just approach that? Because I find that for me, that was sort of the biggest, for a while, I kept myself from doing it because I was so nervous.
I was a little nervous at first, not because I was afraid they wouldn't do the show or I never knew what to say to them, but because it was so weird getting to talk to people who I've watched on TV since I was a child and then asking them to appear on my show. It was very surreal early on in the show, but eventually I got over it. Because think about it, you watch these people on TV for years and then you get to, talk to them on your computer in your room. It's a very strange, surreal thing.
What is something that stands out to you, and with maybe a few of the actors that you've talked to, is there something that, surprised you that you heard from one of them, or something that has really kind of resonated with you as somebody who does love film?
One of the reasons I love character actors, and this is something I've gained an appreciation for when I did this show, was that character actors are just like you and me. They have normal jobs, not normal jobs, but they have normal lives. They take their kids to soccer practice, they go to the supermarket, they do normal things that normal people do, except they work long hour schedules, 18-hour days on film and television sets, and they're on TV all the time. And that's what always amazed me about them. Because the thing about actors is everyone thinks that, actors are these sort of, far removed from reality kind of people that, live on this sort of, how should I say this, live this wealthy life that's sort of removed from everyone in reality. But, character actors aren't like that. They're a lot more down to earth.
Right. And I would imagine for them, they're not always recognized out in public, because you've heard from a lot of actors, especially character actors, that they're not obsessed with the fame of it. They really are interested in the work. Have you found that to be the case in some of your conversations with the people you've talked to so far?
Very true. I mean, a lot of actors, as I said before, character actors get to play the kind of roles that leading actors never get to play. Um, most of them sacrifice being a movie star because they just want to play interesting roles. They want to show up to work every day and play a role that they're really engaged in and immersed in.
One of my favorites is William H. Macy, and I think I heard you mention him in your video when you were sort of kicking off your podcast. Is that somebody that you are going to be talking to or interviewing?
There's no plans, but I would love to interview him one day. I mean, he's certainly one of my favorite character actors, and it's guys like him that made me want to do a show like this.
Were you ever interested yourself in acting or anything in that world?
Acting was never something I was interested in. It always seemed kind of silly to, show up to work every day and be other people and put on makeup. I mean, it's something I respect, but it's never something I ever imagined myself doing. But I have had some experience working in the film industry. Before I did this podcast, I was a production assistant. I was an associate producer, worked on a lot of independent projects, Lifetime movies. So it's definitely a world that I'm certainly familiar with to some degree.
Who's somebody that you would, one of your favorites that you would really love to sit down and talk to, if you haven't already?
There's so many of them, but I think number one on the list of character actors I would love to interview would be Gary Oldman. Gary's always been one of my favorite actors. I don't think there's a character or type of character he couldn't play. I'm always amazed by the fact that he can just sort of slip in and out of roles without ever going through a whole method process.
What are kind of your bigger goals for the podcast moving forward? Where would you like to see it go?
Well, of course, I would love to gain more listeners. I would love to get to the point where I can get higher profile guests. Because that's the thing, I'm starting out as a podcaster now. I can get, a lot of named guests, but I can't get every named guest because, early on in a show, you don't have a lot of listeners and you're growing. The publicists and the agents don't want their, clients going on a show that only has 20 million, 20 listeners or so. So yeah, I would definitely love to, gain a bigger audience and thus create a better show.
Is there a film that you've seen recently that you've kind of zeroed in on the character actors in that, maybe a more recent film, maybe even one that at the Academy Awards, one of the films that won an Academy Award?
To be honest with you, I don't watch a lot of recent films. I mostly watch films from the 80s and 90s. I think recent films just don't interest me. I feel that movies today are more about just sort of preaching to the public instead of just entertaining people. So I don't really watch many modern films.
What are some other films from the 80s that kind of stood out to you?
There's one movie called To Live and Die in LA, which was directed by William Friedkin. Have you ever seen it?
No, I haven't, but I've heard of it. I remember.
If you love 80s action films, definitely give it a watch. It's I think the greatest 80s action film ever made, and it's certainly the greatest 80s action film that no one's ever seen. It stars William Peterson as a Secret Service agent who's bent on stopping a counterfeiter by the name of what's his character's name? Rick Masters, played by Willem Dafoe. And it's chock full of great character actors. Willem Dafoe, John Turturro, John Pankow, and many others. And it has what I consider to be the greatest car chase of all time. So yeah, definitely check it out.
One of the things that I also admire about character actors is that they're not confined to just feature films. You see them pop up, in like episodic television, whether it's sitcoms or dramas on TV. They can pop in and out of anything. And obviously major stars, I think they feel like they're above some of the things that are on television or whatever, Netflix. But I've always thought that was something that was really interesting about character actors, is that they didn't really have an attitude about doing whatever the work was in whatever medium. Do you find that to be true as well?
Very true. I mean, character actors are sort of the blue collar equivalent of Hollywood screen actors. Um, you know, again, they just look for what the role provides them as an artist. They're not looking at the fame and the notoriety. And that's what I love about character actors. You know, they do it for the love of the art, not for the fame and the glory and the attention so much. Well, in our next episode, I have Mr. Romeo Carey. He's the son of the legendary character actor Timothy Carey. In case you've in the audience have never heard of him, he was a really brilliant actor. Had a very manic acting style that inspired the likes of Nicolas Cage, Crispin Glover, Johnny Depp, and so forth. You've seen him in a lot of Stanley Kubrick films. He was in Paths of Glory. He was in The Killing, among other films, and eventually did a lot of television in the 70s and eventually a play with Salvador Dali. I recommend everyone to check it out who's a fan of old movies because not much is known about Timothy Carey, but you'll learn a lot about him in this episode.
And you mentioned Crispin Glover, who I also love.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's eccentric. He doesn't
Right.
the mainstream films. I haven't really seen him in anything lately. But he's another one of those character actors that really, I remember when he did the film, it was kind of a remake, or Willard. Did you see that one?
Yeah, a long time ago.
Yeah. And so I love performances like that because it's so different and it goes against the grain, the
Right.
Hollywood sort of world. Because I love a lot of independent films as well. And you're also talking to Lance Henriksen, right?
Yep. Always been a fan of Lance. When I did the show, he was one of the first people I thought of. Through some connections, I was able to contact him, and he was very happy to do the show.
Now, in 1981, you starred in Piranha 2, which was not only James Cameron's debut feature, but also the first movie you did with him. What was your first impression of James Cameron, and how did you hit it off so well?
I had called the producer. I had done one other movie with him called, I don't even want to tell you the name of it, but it's a movie in Italy where I was the young guy, I was the gigolo, and there was a bunch of strange people around me. And I had no idea what that movie was about, called The Visitor. It was.
Oh, yeah, with Franco Nero and Martin Balsam, I think so. Yeah.
But I love it. I mean, I was in Italy for the first time and went and bought linen suits. But anyway, so the reason I brought that up is the same producer. So as Piranha 2. Mm-hmm. So I went down, I called him before and I said, I have to drive a boat in this, I'm a harbor cop. And I went down and I said, I have to try it, so I don't want to wreck it. So I get there, they have no wardrobe. We're borrowing the boat from a guy, paying him. And also, so I have no wardrobe. So I see a waiter at an outdoor restaurant who's my size. And I said, can I buy your clothes? And he said, what? And so, but it had a stripe down. They were like a Camino, what do you call it? They looked like it could be a cop or it could be a doorman or whatever. And I have saved the whale pins, my shoulder bag, Save the Whale and, all that stuff. So I bought it from him. You weren't allowed to have a gun down in Jamaica, so I carved my own gun for the holster and saved the whale pins on my epaulets and turned them upside down so you couldn't read it. And it turned myself into a harbor cop. So that was my tenacity. And I was watching Jim's tenacity, who made a mountain out of crap. He really did. He had miniatures. We had the whole crew making miniature boats that have to blow up in the parking lot and all of that kind of stuff. So but I ended up, the first scene I was in was to pull up by a pier. They didn't let me learn how to use the boat. So I ended up putting the boat up on the pier. Mm-hmm. You should have seen the owner of it. The guy was a big, huge Jamaican guy. And look what you did on my boat, man. And it was like flipping out. I said, Jim, you said you would get between me and that guy. So have at it.
Well, you talked about doing work yourself in the film industry. So what kind of work did you do before you started podcasting? You said that you were like a production, or what was it that you were doing?
Well, I started as a production assistant. I originally wanted to get into film and TV production, but eventually I decided to, move away from that. I just couldn't stand the 18-hour schedules anymore. But yeah, I started as a production assistant. I worked on student films and eventually worked my way up to working on television films and reality shows like 90 Day Fiance. And eventually I did associate producer work for a couple of short films. But after COVID, I just decided to, go a different way in my life.
You were saying earlier that you really like the older films, like even from the 40s, not really much into films today. What is it about the films from that era, specifically the 40s or older, that attracted you?
I think it was their sense of escapism. I mean, you could watch movies, you could watch anything from the 40s or the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever, and feel like you're watching a movie, because that's what movies are supposed to do. They're supposed to take you from reality and put you in a different place. You're supposed to feel like you're watching something that was created and not so much, just shot on the spot, a documentary style, if that makes any sense. So yeah, I think films recently have kind of lost that. I think everything has become too serious. I think everything has become way too preachy. I love older movies so much because back then Hollywood was more concerned with making quality films. Nowadays, studios just sort of churn stuff out with no sense of integrity.
Well, yeah, and a lot of, there's been a lot of discussion or criticism, I think, with all the major like superhero films that have become very cookie cutter. Like that's all you see. It's these big budget pictures instead of, they don't even have to be indie, but I think that there's no creativity. It seems like a lot of it is people are either trying to remake stuff that they can't make any better, or they're trying to profit. It's all for profit now. And not that the Hollywood world hasn't always been for profit to some degree, but it does feel to me as somebody who does love film that it has become so much more now about that first weekend. If it doesn't make this ridiculous amount of money that's unrealistic in some ways, that it's a flop. When it makes like $35 million, but because it costs so much to make, it's not considered successful. Is that how you kind of view sort of today's cinema as well?
I don't think there's a lack of creativity. I think there's a lack of how should I say this? I think there's no one's really taking chances on creative material anymore because they're afraid. Once upon a time, studios spent millions and millions of dollars on original ideas, on films that had new stars, actors that weren't really famous yet. So I think that's just the problem. But think about it. Every big movie that has a franchise started out as an original idea. Star Wars started out as an original idea. Well, for them, somewhat. Star Trek started out as an original idea. Iron Man started out as an original idea because people were willing to take chances. If you try to make Star Wars today or The Godfather or any big film today, you would get turned down immediately because it's not connected to anything that people are familiar with.
If people want to watch or rather listen to your show, where can they find it?
You can find my show on YouTube on the What a Character podcast YouTube page. You can actually watch the show there. You can also listen to my show on Spotify, iTunes, and wherever you listen to podcasts. And I would also recommend listeners to go on the What a Character podcast website and subscribe to my email list. That way you can receive episodes in your email inbox.
Is there anything else that you would like to add or that you want to get out there about the show?
Yes. I just want to tell the audience that if you are a major cinephile who loves to hear stories about your favorite movies, or you're just a struggling actor yourself who wants to learn about the business from the perspective of Hollywood's best and most prominent character actors, you'll definitely want to listen to this show. You'll get a lot out of it.
Cool. Can people also, like, if they have any ideas of people they'd like to see you interview, could they like drop you a message as well?
Most certainly. You can message me on Facebook on the What a Character Facebook page, or on Instagram or on Twitter. Just type in What a Character and you'll find me.